Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming out on this sort of nasty night. My name is Marcia Eli, and on behalf of my colleagues here at the Center for Brooklyn History and our team over at the Brooklyn Public Library, which we are part of, and my team, the Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, I have the honor of saying a few words of greeting tonight. So we're welcoming Terence Keel this evening, professor of human biology, society, and African American studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, whose new book, The Coroner's Silence, Death Records and the Hidden Victims of Police Violence, reveals how incomplete autopsy reports, mishandled medical records, and strategically lost evidence shield law enforcement from accountability. Professor Keel is the founding director of the Biocritical Studies Lab at UCLA. There, he leads a landmark study that uncovered how death investigations can and often do obscure the violent circumstances of in-custody deaths. Just a little tiny personal digression here. At the Center for Brooklyn History, our collections are at the heart of the institution, and our reference librarians work day in and day out with researchers, in our case, researching archival materials of all kinds related to Brooklyn. But I just have to take the opportunity to connect the dots here and share an appreciation of the work that Professor Keel undertook digging deep into records. And we'll hear more about that work shortly, and the seminal research documented in the book, The Coroner's Silence. I'm absolutely thrilled that Professor Keel will be led in conversation this evening by Alex Vitale, professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. Professor Vitale has spent the last 30 years writing about policing and advising community-based movements, human and civil rights organizations, and governments. He is the author of the books City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, and The End of Policing. His writings have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Nation, to name a few, and he is frequently tapped as an expert, having appeared on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, PBS, and the list goes on. So following their conversation, we'll turn to you and your questions. Our ushers will bring a mic to you in your seats. Please just help us out by standing when you ask your question and keeping them as brief as you possibly can. You might have seen as you came in that the Coroner's Silence is on sale at the CBH shop over there, and Terence is ready to sign copies at a table in the front following the program. It's really an honor to host you both tonight here. I'm so excited to hear this conversation. Please help me welcome Terence Keel and Alex Vitale.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a rainy, cold evening here. It's really great to see everyone. Terence, thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Terence and I had not met before this evening, and I discovered, among other things, that we're both at least partially the products of a Southern Jesuit education, yes, which I think is possibly relevant to this conversation in a way. Because it speaks to a kind of ethical perspective that we bring to our understanding about some of the institutions that we're going to be talking about tonight. But let's start by talking a little bit about how you got started in this rather striking line of inquiry.
So thank you for that. Thank you for this opportunity to share this work with you. I, like many of us, was fundamentally changed by witnessing the public murder of George Floyd, which feels so long ago. If you think about the current political moment that we're in, it doesn't seem like that was 5 years ago. It feels much longer. And I remember in that moment witnessing his death. And then later, if you remember, the controversy around George Floyd started around his autopsy. Because when the Hennepin County Medical Examiner released his death record, they said that it was a homicide, but the primary cause of death, and I quote, was cardiopulmonary arrest complicating law enforcement subdual, end quote. So what does that mean? It means that George Floyd had a bad heart. His bad heart made it hard for him to be arrested. That's why police had to use force. So I wondered to myself, one, how many more George Floyds are there? And how many more cases were written like this, where the medical examiner came to a conclusion that on the surface seemed right, but the logical sequence of events that happened seemed wildly inconsistent? And the reason why we know this about George Floyd is because of Darnella Frazier recording the video, right? So how many more cases are there like George Floyd? That led me to a woman named Helen Jones, whose son, John Horton III, was beaten to death inside of Men's Central Jail in downtown Los Angeles. He was in solitary confinement, but his death was staged to look like a suicide. So they tied a noose around his neck and said that he hung himself. Helen had been working tirelessly for 10 years trying to find elected officials, community organizers, and other families to hear her story. Because when she got John's body, it was a testament to violence. His nose was broken. There was abrasions all over the place. He had recent hematomas on his body. There was blood all over his clothes, things that were wildly inconsistent with suicide. Out of this relationship developed a very powerful partnership where Helen Jones taught me, and then eventually my research team and my staff, how to read an autopsy. Now, I can read an autopsy, like I have degrees, I can do that. But she taught me how to read the autopsy against the archival grain, how to tell a story that the official death record doesn't want you to know. And the only way you can do that is by having experience being impacted by the violence and discrimination of this system. And so I am incredibly indebted to Helen Jones. We are partners in sort of changing the legal landscape of death investigation, both in LA and across this country. Without her bravery and wisdom, this work would not have been possible.
How big of a problem is this? How many people are dying as a result of police action or in jail custody? And do we actually know the answer to that question?
I thought when I started this work, surely there must be some government office, either at the federal, state, or county level, that can tell us who's dying in custody. But when I did the research, I realized really quickly, there is not a single government entity that can tell you the names of people who died in custody in 1973, or 1968, or 1965, or 1991. The infrastructure for developing and gathering that information was intentionally underdeveloped. We don't have a very robust tracking system for gathering death records. What we had to do in my lab is rely on crowd-based sources. So these are sources developed by nonprofit organizations, they're developed by media sources. We had to pull those sources together to tell a patchwork story about death in custody. But we could only go back to the year 2000 because there really weren't robust records before that time. Based on our research, we learned that between 2000 and 2020, 32,103 people have been killed during arrest in the United States. That's just during arrest. So that doesn't include in jail, it doesn't include detention centers, it doesn't include prisons. The way that I like to think about it is that every day, 5 people die in state custody, but we are only going to know the names of 3 of those people. To also put that figure in perspective, 32,103 people, that's more than twice the number of people that have been executed in American history going back to 1608. So just in a 20-year period, police are killing more people than we kill people in official state executions. So what that tells me is that dying in custody is the new capital punishment. And again, these are people dying during arrest. So this is before going to jail, before going in front of a judge, before having an opportunity to defend themselves ostensibly in this criminal justice system. They're denied and robbed of this opportunity.
And this is not just an issue of oversight or lack of technology. You know, there is a federal requirement that this data be presented centrally, and yet local jurisdictions just refuse to comply.
Right, you're talking about the Death in Custody Reporting Act, which was initially established in 2000 to create an incentive for reporting people who die in custody by law enforcement. But there are two major flaws with DICRA. One, there was no money behind it. It literally required states and counties to fund part of the effort to get police to report about the people they're killing, which is the second part of the problem. You're asking the people who are perpetuating the violence to tell on themselves, and that never works, right? So without there being a financial incentive and without there being a strong sort of mandate to do this, what happened essentially is that you get this patchwork of data where certain counties will report this information, but they might omit the race of the person or the age of the person, or they might give you that information for 3 years straight and decide not to do it for the fourth and fifth year. And so essentially it is a system that doesn't deliver on the promise on transparency.
A nightmare for a data scientist.
It's a complete nightmare.
Right, the idea of a data set that is completely inconsistent and patchworked, yes. And in some ways not dissimilar from the weaknesses in our crime data, where we have jurisdictions that don't report or where there are accusations of corruption in the reporting, and yet we base a lot of our public policy and our academic research on the data that we have available, even though we know it's inaccurate. So you had to basically create your own data set.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about how you were able to assemble a body of death records that allowed you to conduct a sort of systematic analysis.
So I was fortunate enough to work with a group of brilliant students who were part of this research effort that were partners with our community partners and the people who are impacted by this violent system. And we created what we call the list of lost lives, which is publicly available. When you look at the book, you can find our data set, that you can download the data. You can also find all of the autopsies that are discussed in this book. What we use that list to do is to map where the violence was happening over this 20-year period, because we only could go back to the year 2000. And then we identified, again, these are just the names that police have reported that have died in custody. So these don't include people where police had someone in custody, they might have beaten that person, and then they release that person from custody, and then they die on their way home. There are many cases where police release people from the jurisdiction and they never get counted. So the ones that do count, what we then do is that we identify whether they are dying in an open record or a closed record state. That matters a great deal, because a state like New York, for example, is a state where none of you in this room can get an autopsy of someone who died in custody. The medical examiner ostensibly writes these reports for the public interest and for the public good, but state law in the state of New York forbids public access to death records. But that isn't true in California. It's not true in Texas. It's not true in Florida. So this isn't just a sort of a red or a blue issue. It's a systematic problem where we don't have strong federal leadership. We don't have a strong guidance from Congress on how to actually gather this information and make it accessible. And so when you don't have those things, you have to be innovative and create your own solutions, and that's what we've done. So long story short, we use the names in open record states to use FOIA requests to get those death records. And from there, we've developed a very complex system to analyze these death records and turn them into data. But at the core of all of this is Helen Jones, who was the first to put together an anatomy textbook and a legal dictionary and sit on her kitchen and just read her son's autopsy to understand what was going on.
You describe that as a kind of a system of viral justice, right? That relied on a partnership between academics and those who've been directly affected by this failed system.
Right, I'm citing the work of Ruha Benjamin, who talks about viral justice as sort of everyday folks who are already doing the business of repairing and designing the institutions that we need for the future that we need. And when I met Helen Jones, she had already been in the trenches doing this work for a decade. before I arrived on the scene. And I think there's a valuable story there in that name a social problem that bothers you, and I promise I can show you an organization that's already doing the work to solve that problem. And I think for academics, we're not often used to being the one who's not the center of knowledge and authority, right? In this case, Helen Jones was the one who had the knowledge and the authority. In fact, my training in many ways was designed not to see the kinds of truth and experience that you could see in these autopsies.
Yeah, that is a huge issue, right? So many academics who are drawn to important issues are not trained how to work with community partners, and if anything, are trained not to see them. So tell us a little bit about, you opened with this a little bit, the flavor of how these coroner reports obscure the cause of death and provide cover for the underlying forces at work that lead to these deaths. So give us a little more flavor of that, and maybe tell us a little bit about, what is this special role that coroners play in this process, and why is it important?
According to the letter of the law, the job of the coroner or the medical examiner, and it depends on what state you live in, their job is to provide an account of what happened before, during, and after someone dies under mysterious or violent circumstances. So they do investigations that involve police violence, but they also do investigations that involve domestic violence, or someone stumbles on a body in the woods and they don't know how this person died. Where things become complex and problematic is that when it comes to death investigators investigating police violence, bias, influence, and a host of other things can change how the record is written. And what we've learned is that this happens in subtle ways and it happens in very explicit ways. One subtle way this happens is you read an autopsy, and the first thing that you read about this person is that they were a drug addict. Or you might read that they were unemployed. And you might be asking yourself as a member of the public, how is this relevant to the biological conditions that cause that person to end their life? What's happening with that record is that they are trying to compel a story or create a story that's compelling enough for you to believe, oh, this person was living on the edge already. This person had a pre-existing drug condition already. This person was negligent. This person was living in such a way that they might have died independent of police and law enforcement. It happens in other ways as well. You might read a death record where the person has a history of asthma, for example. And that might then be used to say, well, when they were pepper sprayed, they weren't actually reacting so much to the pepper spray as their respiratory system was already compromised before police pepper sprayed this individual. And that's why they died. Over and over again, these death records are written in a way where they erase, minimize, or amend the agency of police on the bodies of these victims. In some cases, these records are written almost as if these people died in a room by themselves or died by themselves on the street, and law enforcement weren't there at all. And there are some cases where actually medical examiners might actually downplay the circumstances that are on someone's body. Now, how does this happen? Often, medical examiners don't run for office. So what does that mean? It means that none of you are going to be voting for your medical examiner. There's going to be a local official, either at the county level or at the state level, that's going to appoint a medical examiner. And in some states, they have unlimited terms. So they might be in their role for 10, 12 years. And anytime you have a government institution with officials who have that much power, who are not accountable to the public, and who don't have term limits, you invite the possibility for conflict of interest and for bias. And that happens, it doesn't matter whether you're in a red state or a blue state, it's an inherent bug, it's an inherent feature of how this system works.
And the day-to-day work of the coroner or the medical examiner is performed often in conjunction with the institution of policing.
Absolutely.
So that if there is a homicide or a suspected homicide, police detectives are present for the autopsy and, in essence, play a role in co-producing the ultimate report. And then, in a case where a police officer is involved in some way in a death, it's still the police department that's sitting there in the room co-producing the autopsy.
Absolutely. You know, it was shocking for us to find in some counties they actually have a box that says who was present during the autopsy and the number of times law enforcement are present during the autopsies. And then looking at correlations between, well, what's the race, age, and gender of the person when law enforcement are in the actual room for the autopsy. And you can imagine, you've got police in the room and you're doing a medical investigation with police looking over your shoulder. You don't have a context for how this person died. You got a story that law enforcement are telling you, and you've got some notes that maybe someone on the scene gave you, a forensic investigator. It's a system that's designed to really protect and insulate police from review. The way I like to think about it is, Alex, it's harder for you and I to get a peer review article published than it is for a medical examiner to write a death report, which, by the way, will be a final official statement that makes the difference between whether or not that family can sue or not. Because if it's a natural death, if the medical examiner said George Floyd died because he just had a bad heart, it makes it incredibly difficult for the families to hire a lawyer to sue the county, because ultimately what the medical examiner would have said in that case is that he was just sick. Police weren't involved in why he died at all. So you can see, and we find this in our data, the number of cases where people are dying under incredibly violent circumstances, but the cause and manner of death are natural.
And part of what this story is that you tell is this medicalization of the death examination process that was not always the case. That we've taken out all of the kind of social factors at work here that contribute to someone ending up in the medical examiner's office. You have this wonderful analogy to Ellison's Invisible Man of the body hollowed out of its social essence and left with just the physicality. But all deaths are socially situated. So how did we get into this situation? Because the role of coroner is something that's been around for hundreds of years,
That's right.
But its role has really changed.
There are two parts to that question. One, coroners are some of the earliest democratic institutions in American history. When the colonists arrived in the 17th century, the Crown of England sent his crowners. And the job of the crowner was to make sure that debts and resources were paid back to the crown, because the crown was making investments on plantations and a bunch of other things. And if someone happened to die in the colony, the crowner would make sure those resources would go back. After independence, the role of the crowner became the coroner, which is where we get the word coroner from. It's sort of an American English translation of the crowner. In the very early period of sort of this nation's history, if someone died mysteriously, the coroner would find 12 white male citizens, because they were the ones who counted. And those 12 white male citizens would determine who was responsible, how this person died, and what were the charges that were supposed to be brought against this person. This was a radical form of direct democracy. After emancipation, when the project of democracy gets expanded to formerly enslaved black people, states begin to amend their constitutions, and they do two things. One, they begin to require the coroner to have a medical license, which in some ways was really important, because in the very beginning, you didn't have to be a physician or a man of science to actually do this work. You just needed to know community and be really good at having intuition. But when we began to create public health systems and take care of things like yellow fever and pandemics, you needed a medical examiner who could do the difficult work of figuring out, did this person die because of a plague that we haven't identified yet, or is there something else going on? But they did something else. Making them a medical examiner began to insulate them from direct democracy. So these medical examiners became people who were appointed by government rather than running for office. And that set us on this trajectory where two things happen when a death investigation happens. One, they write the reports really to protect the county and to protect law enforcement from the people. But then secondly, they're narrowly focused on the anatomy and the biology of the people who are dying. And the way I like to think about this is that it's a consequence of two things. One, we as a nation, because of the influence of neoliberalism, which says all of us are best when we live in a society where we have limited government intervention, which means no government in healthcare, no government in regulating housing, no government in regulating access to food and wages. Let the free market decide all of that. So government has been retreating from our lives, and I think we all feel this, right? The evaporation of the social safety net is something incredibly pressing here in a city like New York, right? But when government retreats, we lose the ability to see how institutional violence makes us sick, makes us vulnerable, makes us unhealthy. We know, for example, cutting of Medicare and Medicaid will kill 50,000 people every single year. That's not because those people were going to die before. They're going to die because of policy violence, because of elected officials making decisions. I think what the medical examiner sees when we die is a symptom of a larger problem in our society, which is that we are unable to see how structural violence and inequality tallies inside of us, makes some of us ill than others. The fact that we don't often have access to healthcare and housing, things that actually create durable populations who can withstand different types of exposures. All of that is being taken away, and the death investigator leaves us with an analysis that sees us as if we're not living in society, as that each of us are these sort of free, autonomous beings that are not connected to these larger systems.
They're taking the sociology out of it. As a working sociologist, I have to point that out, right? That things have social causes.
Absolutely.
And the medicalization is trying to erase that. And it is in the service of protecting systems that are producing grave injustices. You mentioned box checking on the forms earlier, and you mentioned a proposal from the former medical examiner in D.C. to
Roger Mitchell III,
include a box on all these forms that could be ticked that says, you know, was this death related to being in custody?
Mm-hmm. I think that would be, you know, we're talking about Roger Mitchell Jr., who's a former medical examiner of D.C. That would be a very easy solution. We're just talking about a box on a death certificate. Because right now, when someone dies in custody, you have no idea on the death certificate whether or not law enforcement were involved. The only way you would know that is if you got that person's name and then fact-checked it against the coroner's data set of people that they happen to have reported on that year, which also may not happen. So putting a box on the death certificate would be good, partially because it gives another layer of transparency and accountability in the hands of the people, which is what we don't have, right? And I think that's one solution, but I think we need more. I think honestly, and this gets in sort of into the work that you do, we need solutions that prevent people who are vulnerable ending up in police custody. What I learned more than anything else is that the people that I wrote about in this book were people who had already been failed many times over by democracy. These are people who were unhoused, or who were underemployed, or who had substance abuse issues, or who had mental health issues, or who didn't have access to health care. These are people who needed basic human needs. And I think if we provide basic human needs, people will be less likely to pick up the phone and call law enforcement in the middle of a mental health crisis. They might call a social worker, or they might go to alternatives to policing and incarceration, which in Los Angeles have been really effective at diverting people from this carceral system and this police system that we know kill people, shorten people's lives, leave us unhealthy.
Yeah, I want to come back to some of that, but I want to, you know, I was on a panel with, I'm sorry, say his name again?
Roger Mitchell Jr.
Yeah, I always have trouble remembering his name. And we were on a panel together not too long ago about an additional hidden population, which is people who die in the medical system after having an encounter with the police or an incident in the jail system.
Right.
And so even your exhaustive work may not capture those cases because there might not even be an autopsy because they died in a hospital.
Absolutely.
Under medical supervision.
I read about a young black man named Stanley Wilson Jr. He was a Stanford graduate, played for the NFL for the Detroit Lions, had some mental health issues in Los Angeles, was being transported from one jail facility to another, during the transport had a health crisis, dies, law enforcement say he wasn't in our custody because he was in transport. And if it wasn't for his mother, Pulani Lucas, we would have never known about Stanley's death. But she was an advocate to make sure, look, my son was in custody. You're not going to allow his death to be erased and taken off of the rolls. But not everyone has a mother like that. Not everyone has community like that. And so what we need to do is develop systems that hold police accountable, because they have too much power over us when we're in their custody.
There are a lot of cases where the only reason we know is because some nurse in the emergency room or in the admitting ward, made an effort to talk to the family or to alert someone. I'm thinking of the case of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, of Abner Louima here in New York City, where it was there was no system to make sure we got that information. It relied on the goodwill of an individual within those institutions, and that can't possibly be the solution to this problem.
And those medical staff are often very vulnerable to intimidation and threats of violence from police. I have a colleague at UCLA who's beginning to study this work, where the nursing staff try to stand up for people who are being handcuffed to beds while they need medical service, and police refuse to take this person out of handcuffs. And then later, law enforcement will say something about that, and these people are vulnerable. So you're right, we need better systems than what we currently have.
So we're caught in this terrible dynamic where we're both producing this huge population of people who are incredibly vulnerable, have been incredibly marginalized, to go back to Ellison, and at the same time, lionizing a set of institutions of control and punishment with no meaningful accountability. And you have this wonderful little sentence I'll take the liberty of quickly reading. Their noncompliance of police and jails stems from a commitment to a much older tradition where violence maintains the local power of police, racial hierarchy, and calculated chaos. And I was really struck in particular by this idea of calculated chaos. Could you tell us a little bit what you were thinking there?
So what I'm saying in that quote it's layered. One, the racist systems designed to police, intimidate, and disenfranchise Black Americans has evolved. And now that system has evolved to identify any person who's a threat, any person who's having a mental health day, any person who is non-compliant. They can be subjected to the violence of this policing system. So there's that part of it. The other part of it is that anytime you have a law enforcement agency that has a district attorney that refuses largely to prosecute people, operates in a vacuum where no one looks at their records, and has a medical examiner they can bank on that's going to write records in their favor, you're designing a system that is wildly unaccountable. And what that creates then is when you try to peer into that system, you see things like records where the internal organs of the person are missing. So the family can't actually do a secondary autopsy to verify what happened to the kidney, the liver, the spleen.
That's something that Colin Kaepernick has been supporting
Absolutely.
around the country. Since 2020, he's been paying for these secondary autopsies to support families.
Absolutely, yes. It's the Know Your Right initiative, and any family member who's lost someone in police violence, they'll provide a secondary autopsy. But I think of that as calculated chaos, because what's happening is that police and coroners are sending people home to their families, missing puzzles, missing pieces to a puzzle that they can't solve. How do you know what happened to your son or daughter if you don't have their brain or you don't have their internal organs? Really, you would want that information, right? So missing evidence, missing details happen in a system that's aware of the fact that it's not accountable. It's aware of the fact that people may not peer over your shoulder and look at this. When my lab, and some of my students are in this room right now who are part of the lab, when my lab began to investigate this work, we released a report showing all the bias and the violence of these records. And we we requested records from a short time period, 2009, 2019. They didn't give us everything. They gave us a third of what they should have given us, but they didn't know we knew more existed. So then we doubled up our requests. We asked for more records, but that was after we reproduced some reports. When they gave us those records, entire sections were now redacted. Entire sections that just a few months before would have been available to us to read and to analyze. Those were all entirely blacked out. That's calculated chaos. That's creating strategic ignorance. It's creating strategic lack of information to allow for this system to continue without being held accountable.
So in addition to having a box saying, in custody death or police related, you've also proposed a much more expansive approach to trying to at least provide transparency about these deaths in custody. Tell us a little bit about the proposal that you've shopped around in places like Maryland to try to create a new system to getting more clarity about what's going on.
Often when you read a book like this, the author at the end will sort of say, here are 6 things that you can do in your community. And I think those approaches are great. They're great. I decided to do something a little bit different. What I decided to do was to take you through the steps of me working with Carmen Johnson, who is an incredible activist in the state of Maryland, in our effort to drum up support in the Maryland General Assembly to design a law, which we wrote, that actually proposed transparency and accountability in a third-party system. We proposed a civilian-ran committee that would do a third review or secondary review of every single autopsy of anyone who died in custody, whether in jail or during arrest. And we proposed a rotating staff of forensic pathologists who were not associated with the medical examiner system. We proposed putting impacted community on that board. We proposed putting leaders of social justice organizations, but then also a rotating staff of elected officials, because we knew if this was going to work, we needed to have buy-in from local government. That bill was also drawn from bills in Chicago and in Los Angeles that had passed, that were successful. So we were integrating other successful efforts into this bill. We had a lot of support in the General Assembly. We had a lot of elected officials who would say to us, I'm completely embarrassed by the amount of deaths in custody. This bill is going to help change things. Well, when the bill went through the House, it was amended without consulting us. And elected officials removed, and this won't be surprising, the community oversight and replace community oversight with, you guessed it, law enforcement, which also included a budget item to increase the amount of revenue coming into the office to cover the expenses of this oversight. So I wrote that in the book, one, because I wanted to show this system is actually vulnerable if we organize and we push for legislative change. We don't have to accept this state of affairs. But I also wrote that in the book to be able to sort of warn others who are going to do work like this. These are the types of hazards that might happen. You might get really far in this process, but then, elected officials might choose to take away a little bit of power from the people in the community and put it back into the hands of police and law enforcement. And if you're working with elected officials, get ahead of that now. Think about how you can bring in officials early to the process to ensure something that's civilian ran, that's accountable to the people and the public, because that's what we need.
And that requires, though, a level of kind of political bravery that we have not seen enough of. You remind us in the book of the story of Henry Gates, who was harassed by police in his own home in Cambridge, the Harvard professor several years ago now, and how that contributed to a kind of public opening for Obama to talk about the racialized nature of American policing and the kind of structurally racist elements of it. But in the end, he pulled back from that. He said, yeah, let's have a beer in the Rose Garden and make up. So how do we demand some backbone from these elected officials so that they are willing to make a concrete stand for racial justice, because that's really is like this line that they will come up to, they will kneel with some kente cloth, but getting them to really expend political capital for a real investment in racial justice just hasn't been forthcoming.
I think the answer to that question is us. One, we have to sober up from the idea that policing and law enforcement keeps us safe. It doesn't. It doesn't. We are using police to clean up the mess that's created when we evaporate the social safety net. That's what's happening. So what that means is that we need to, I believe, confront the violence of this system and all of the victims in this system, and to see that this is a truly American dilemma. Every single segment of American society is found in our nation's death ledger. Middle-aged white women, conservatives, Republicans, Middle Eastern populations, non-binary folks, mixed-race people, 35-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 70-year-olds. Yes, black men and Latino men are disproportionately represented in this violence, but they're not the only ones. And it's important that we realize we might have lived lives of division, but all of us end up on the same examination tables of the medical examiner. So the first step involves us realizing this is a system that if we don't force it to be accountable, then one day we just might find ourselves on the wrong side of the law. And we are currently sitting with the president who determines who's on the right and the wrong side of the law. And I don't think if there's ever a moment beyond this one for us to wake up to realize we cannot concede power to conservative forces that would silence our voice. So I think it starts with us. Then I think we need to put the pressure on elected officials at the local and state level. What is your criminal justice reform policy? And don't tell me it involves giving more money to police, because that never works. What alternatives to policing incarceration are you developing? How are you dealing with affordable wages? How are you dealing with access to health care? These are the material conditions that keep us safe. When we have inequality that's out of control, we have precarity and we have people that are vulnerable. So if we want a better system, we have to give people basic material needs. That's the core to keeping us safe. It's not police.
I mean, it raises a question about, is even accountability possible, or is the impunity baked into these institutions? I recently proposed for New York City, for the incoming mayor, that he consider the implementation of a sentinel event review process for police involved, for situations where police kill someone, and it could include the death of someone at Rikers, et cetera. A sentinel event review is what they do when, like, a plane crashes. They want a comprehensive investigation whose primary goal is not to find someone guilty, but to try to figure out, why did this happen? How did it happen? And what can we do to prevent this from happening in the future? Because, it's one thing to throw some mechanic in prison, but if the planes keep falling out of the sky, we haven't fixed the problem. And I think that's the situation we're in. But can we really arrive, or I guess really the question is it better to spend our political capital trying to force them to adopt accountability mechanisms that they're opposed to, or to invest our energies in trying to address issues of vulnerability and solve public safety issues outside of that system of punishment and coercion?
I think we need a multi-pronged approach. We need comprehensive social safety net reform across the board. We need to reduce the amount of inequality that results in police coming into contact, with people coming into contact with police. That's the first thing. But I do think you're right. There are things that we can do within the current system that would make a great deal of difference. One might be forcing medical examiners to run for office again. That's always possible. We could do a reform to the state legislature to actually force medical examiners to be accountable to a voting block, which they are not. That's one thing. The other thing is that, and I hope for this book, medical examiners, and I spoke to many of them off the record, who understood exactly what I was saying, who agreed with what I was saying. It occurred to me, they have more tools at their disposal that they aren't using. One is that, let's say you have a county where there's a jail, like Harris County, for example, or Los Angeles County, which every year sets a new record for people dying in custody. The medical examiner, when doing a death investigation, should have that statistical data on their desk so that they can say, wait, 56 deaths in this year? 57 isn't an accident. What's going on with these conditions? We need to be able to think about this statistically rather than what they currently do, which is read every single case in isolation and don't link it to these larger patterns. My lab produces that data. The county should be able to produce that data. The medical examiner should be able to have that data available to them. But more than that, I also think that there are amendments to the way that deaths are classified. So homicide is the most significant classification, and then it suggests someone was murdered. But you can use the homicide designation and say institutional homicide. The institution is what killed this person. Or homicide, comma, medical neglect. This person died because they were given a drug to detox, which at the intake they said, don't give me this drug because I have an allergic reaction to it. Medical staff gave it to them anyways. This person died because of medical neglect, homicide. Medical examiners can do this. It's available to them to do this. And I think if they did this, it would give us a clearer record of how these institutions and practices are shortening our lives. So the answer to your question is that I think we need multiple levels of reform. It's not a one solution problem. And I think there's much more we can do as an informed citizenry to push to make this system more accountable.
Great. Well, I have a million more questions, but I'm sure some of you have questions also. So we have a couple of mics that are circulating on each side of the room. So I think if people raise their hands, the people with the mics can set you up. So let's start on this side.
Hi, my name is Jude. I was thinking about professional conflicts that we will have, and I was kind of tethering like with rape cases, how now a lot of hospitals have specialists.
Just hold that microphone right in front of your mouth so we can hear you clearly up here.
Okay, with rape cases, when that happens, there's now a lot of specialists in the hospitals that deal with entering, examining these patients when they get delivered.
You said rape, right?
Yeah, rape.
Yeah, like a rape
And
crisis.
Sexual assault, yes.
And seeing the medical examiner's office is caused overwhelmed with cases, and can we have that type of case where we have trained specialists inside the hospitals to deal with give a preliminary review examination with that, and it kind of forces the hand of a medical examiner to, if they conflict with what's happening, it basically okay, there's something wrong here, and not just a way you just override, but you have to be accountable to what was a preliminary review.
So the question is, can we develop a system within medicine where there are specialists that provide a kind of secondary analysis of what happened to a victim that then might give a competing narrative to what the medical examiner says? I think that's right. I think in some cases that does happen when someone is in jail or someone is, let's say, being pursued by police. Police beat this person up really bad. That person goes to a county facility or county hospital and they die in that hospital. We very often see attending physicians and nursing staff give one account of the injuries, and then we see the forensic investigator and a medical examiner give a different account. The trouble, though, is that the deck is stacked in favor of the medical examiner and law enforcement because it is ultimately the determination of the medical examiner, not the attending physician, that determines what happened to this person. So we'll see countering narratives, but the one that rises to the top, that rises to the DA's desk, is not going to be the attending physician. And so what we really need, again, is an intermediary system, a committee, civilian run potentially, that gets those counter narratives and uses them to do a systemic review of all the times a physician who was attending someone who was not tied to law enforcement came to a conclusion that was different than the medical examiner, and force the medical examiner and law enforcement to explain why this discrepancy exists.
Great. on this side.
Hello. You mentioned, hold on, let me pull it up here because I wrote it down. You mentioned organs missing when they are returned to families. I'm curious, like, how much does being an organ donor play a role in that?
Not usually much at all. These are not cases of people missing organs because they're organ donors. Some of the most notorious cases usually begin with justifications that on their surface seem compelling. So there's a case of Juan Correa Jr., who was a 30-year-old Latino male who was in jail with mental health conditions, was pepper sprayed multiple times by police. He then collapsed outside of his cell. They rushed him into a shower to decontaminate him, and then he died shortly thereafter. The medical examiner removes his lungs because they believe he has asthma. And then they look at his medical history and see that he has some sort of unusual mental health condition. And they remove his brain and his spine, but they don't tell the family this. So when the family gets the body at the mortuary, they knew that the lungs were going to be missing. They didn't know that the brain and the spine was going to be missing. And the physicians took that out of his body because they wanted to do additional analysis and study on it. But what often happens tragically in cases like this is that these organs will get lost in the chain of custody because sometimes they're sending them to facilities out of state or out of the county, or sometimes just the record just goes missing. And so it's not a story of people donating organs, although that does happen. There are cases where people supposedly have a terrible pre-existing condition that killed them, but then you read in the autopsy their organs were donated for someone who wanted to have their life extended. So which one is it? Did they die of a pre-existing condition, or why are their organs in someone else's body? Right? It's a real dark environment that we're working in here, and we need more light on the situation.
Hi, and thank you so much for this. I ask a question wearing the hat of an epidemiologist who has studied violence as a health construct. Mm-hmm. And I have been in spaces where colleagues and I have tried to push broader definitions forward and leaning into structures that exist for chronicling this issue much more thoughtfully. With that as backdrop, I have a question about your retrospective surveillance and comprehensive data review. Did you include deaths that were suicides technically, but in the space of custody or legal intervention of some sort?
Absolutely. The first case that I read and that my lab read is the story of John Horton III, who was a 22-year-old black man who died in solitary confinement. And the county initially said he died because of suicide. But when the mother and the family did secondary investigation and found all the violence on his body that was incompatible with suicide, they changed it to undetermined. And later in the book, I really raised the question, because there are a number of cases who people die from suicide, and the suicide can look really different. It can be cases of supposedly people hanging themselves. There are also cases where people are being chased by law enforcement, and the person jumps off of a building. They're jumping off of a building to be free, but that gets classified as suicide. Can you really kill yourself in the presence of law enforcement? Can you really conduct suicide in the presence of an agency that we know can take your life and not be held accountable for it? So we need to push and interrogate what a suicide actually means in state custody. I don't think it's possible to kill yourself from suicide in state custody. Even if you're in jail, and even if you create the noose, and even if you do hang yourself, the question you have to ask, well, how often did that person see daylight? What was the food that they were eating? Did they get messages from the family that was there? How long were they in solitary confinement? We know the psychological effects of being isolated from people and not seeing the sunlight has incredible consequences. You can engineer suicide if you create the conditions for it. And there, I think we need to be talking about institutional responsibility for these deaths. So I agree with you. We need these broader definitions. And quite frankly, Counties like Los Angeles have done a lot of work when we get public health scholars and scientists behind us to say, this is not just a social justice issue, this is a public health issue.
You know, these institutions are supposed to be providing custody and care.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned that many of these people who die in jails are there pre-trial.
Yes.
They have not been convicted of anything. Some are material witnesses.
Yes.
They're not even accused of anything. But the care is not there, so that every death should be understood as an institutional failure.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that every guard in that cell block should be tried and incarcerated, right? But that it should be understood as an institutional failure that should be fixed so that it is not replicated. But our current system really the only like avenue of potential accountability is either through a criminal legal indictment and prosecution or a monetary tort settlement. But neither of those have proven to feed back into producing better care or less police violence or fewer deaths.
You're right. I mean, when you go to jail, you are considered a ward of the state. The state is your family, technically speaking. So food, water, shelter, dignity, all these things you're entitled to.
Healthcare, yeah.
Right? Healthcare, right? It doesn't happen. One
Education
other thing I'll
for
just add to that.
juveniles. Yeah.
We as a nation are really good when it comes to thinking about individuals who kill people. We're terrible when it comes to thinking about institutions that kill. And institutions kill all the time.
Yep.
I'd like to take it to another level. I've been looking at ICE camps. And I know of a young man, Chow Feng Gay, in Queens, who died by suicide. He's my only suicide in the ICE camps. His ankles and hands were tied, and he was hung in a shower. He had been allowed no visitors. He had no one to talk to. He spoke Mandarin. He was the only one in that camp who spoke Mandarin. So there was nobody to talk to. So technically he was in isolation.
Yeah.
And his brother is desperately trying to find out what happened to him. We're now moving to another level with the ICE camps. So what you're talking about is going to be writ large, and all of us are subject to being in them.
You're right. My lab actually has begun producing reports about ICE detention deaths. And according to our last report, there have been at least 24 people that have died in ICE detention facilities all around the country. And a great number of those deaths are people dying within 2 weeks of being within an ICE detention facility. The case you're talking about is one of those examples, but there are also cases where, I mean, you're living here in the United States, living your life, and you might have a health condition, and then suddenly someone snatches you at your job. What about your medications? What about the stress of I'm a primary breadwinner for my family, and now I'm in this detention facility? The amount of stress hormones that gets produced in that environment, and then the fact that there are not competent medical care, it's just a cocktail for early death. And again, going back to my point, we need to make this system accountable, because if the laws change and suddenly we in this room are on the wrong side of it, this is not a system that's going to provide care. It's not a system that's going to provide reform. And it's not a system that's interested in being held accountable.
Yeah, the cruelty is the point.
The cruelty is the point.
As Stephen Miller and others in the administration have made clear, the point is to terrorize whole communities. Yeah. Have one on this side? Yeah.
Yeah, so you were talking earlier about how coroners sort of began as this almost jury-like system where they would get peers together to evaluate, and it eventually got medicalized and professionalized, and that seems to be the norm now. And the solution you were talking about in Maryland that was proposed almost sounded like the Civilian Complaint Review Board that we have in New York, like this oversight committee to look. But I'm curious, did you come across any examples of forensic investigators or coroner or medical examiner systems in the US where there were ways for people who were not either like trained medically or kind of like cops, basically, to actually have any decision-making power where, someone could actually try to do the right thing, as opposed to this sort of adversarial structure that exists right now, where if you're lucky, you get a medical examiner who wants to do the right thing and is just, maybe getting pressured by cops, as opposed to, practically, they probably just are an extension of the carceral state. So I'm curious, are there existing examples of this, or has that largely been?
And how is that related to the idea of an inquest?
So what I said initially was that medical examiners or coroners were an example of direct democracy, really, because they involved the people. And they held what was called a coroner's inquest. So when they gathered the 12 white male citizens and they started talking about what happened, that was called an inquest. What we're doing in the lab is a version of that. It's a version of what Sheldon Wolin might call fugitive democracy, where we, the people, are creating our own institutions of fact-checking and accountability. And our reports make noise. The things that we do, the medical examiner pays attention to, the district attorney pays attention to. There is real movement from the work that we're doing. Now, your specific question about examples, I have a few. Alex may know some as well. In Los Angeles, we do have the Civilian Oversight Commission, which is, as it says, a civilian-led commission with people from the community that rotate on this commission. Their job is to oversee the sheriff's department, which oversees the county jails. And they can do independent review. They can subpoena the sheriff. They have real legal power. But there are two real problems with this commission. One, the way that the commission was chartered, the sheriff can also appoint deputies on the commission. So there are law enforcement who are on the commission. And then the sheriff is a constitutional sheriff, which means, and this is increasingly becoming weaponized, sheriffs are not accountable in their reading of the law to local commissions and boards. They are accountable to the governor only. And even in that case, they will often say, we are encoded into state law. So they see themselves as above these civilian-run efforts to constrain their power. And so there is another fight to be had at the level of the state legislator. How do you reduce the power of the sheriff that's built into the state constitution? Because until you loosen that up, civilian-run commissions are going to run into a sheriff who might just say, I'm not going to show up to your subpoenas because I don't have to.
Here in New York City, we have what's called the Board of Corrections. Not the Department of Corrections, which actually runs and manages the jail, but the Board of Corrections, which is, in theory, an independent agency with a civilian board that has a presence in the jail system. They have investigators in all the jails. They hold public hearings and, in theory, play an oversight and accountability role for the New York City jail system. The problem is that mayors have been reluctant to pick commissioners who are willing to stand up to the corrections union. This was, of course, true of our current mayor. The question now going forward is whether our incoming mayor will appoint a very different kind of board of corrections, which has real staff and resources and legal authority that could, for instance, try to impose a more holistic death investigation process.
Which, actually, Alex, I wanted to ask this question. I know we got one more from the audience. What is your level of optimism about Mamdani getting this right and our ability to really develop and design something here that doesn't just reproduce the status quo?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, I am on the Mamdani transition team. So we have our first meeting tomorrow. So it is still a little early for me to say what we're going to end up with at the end of this process. Many of us were not thrilled with the choice of police commissioner. We understand it as a certain kind of political calculation in the context of his overall agenda about affordability. I think that if you look at Mamdani, his chief of staff, some of the people who are advising him, I think they understand these issues. I think they're extremely sympathetic to our point of view. You know, I was involved in some of the early discussions around the proposals around the Department of Community Safety. Mm-hmm. But the question is what comes out at the end of the sausage grinder. And there are a lot of competing powerful forces at work here. And I think it's an open question. And therefore, I think it's open to influence. And I think that means that we all need to stay vigilant and we need to keep the pressure on. He's going to have leadership in the city council that's not entirely sympathetic to his agenda, especially on this issue. And so it's going to require a battle.
Yeah.
We have time for just one more question, if anybody has a question. One final question.
Oh, whatever.
Thank you. I guess I was thinking about a question a bit ago with like reconciling accountability and maybe abolition and the question of, how do we unseat policing and prosecutorial conduct while also, maybe advocating for police and corrections workers to be prosecuted. And I guess you mentioned something along the lines of, sorry, I gotta check my notes. Like what does making the system accountable, which you mentioned, look like outside of, putting police officers in prison?
Well, like I said, I think there need multiple solutions happening at the same time. So we need resources back into the social safety net. So that if that person who's having a mental health crisis, they don't call 911, they dial another number, and a social worker provides them the needs that they actually have. We don't have a robust system like that.
In a way, like universal medical care is a police reform.
Yes, exactly. The idea is if you can divert resources away from law enforcement and to alternatives. In Los Angeles, there's a program, an initiative called Care First programs. So they're very material things. Beds for people who are unhoused, facilities for people who are unwell, shelter for people who are also unhoused. These are things that divert people away from police and carceral institutions. So you need that. But I also think that these systems are vulnerable to legislative reform. Like I said, getting the medical examiner to run for office. We would need an elected official in a state like New York to run that up, the legislator to actually make that case. Getting just the medical examiner to modify how they classify death records. That's a training issue, but it's also an accountability issue that they will do and respond to if they know that the public is paying attention. So I think these things they're layered. And while I think abolitionists' goal should be our focus, I think we have to have concrete material steps to get us to the kind of future that we all want.
I would just add that I think that holistic death review boards, public inquests, sentinel event reviews, those things are not going to transform policing and incarceration.
No, I agree.
But what they do, I think, help us accomplish is decentering this idea that policing in jails exists primarily to produce public safety and well-being. And they allow us to see more clearly the actual functioning and fundamental nature and the harms that are inherent in those institutions. And that is one part of the equation of making space to shift resources to build new infrastructures of public safety.
I 100% agree with that. What you're talking about are systems that create a stream of data and information that exposes the violence of this system. There's one caveat, though, that I think is important given where we are. Will legacy media pay attention? Think about 2020. The amount of staff devoted to criminal justice reform, police violence, it was everywhere. This stuff is absent. And it's not like death in custody stopped. They've actually have continued at a pace that continue to break records. So part of the problem is if we have these institutions that create this data stream, we, the people, the public, have to be dialed in to where that information is. And whether that means looking at alternative media sources and not legacy media, or whether it just means Googling your local official's office to see what records they're producing. I don't think we can rely on legacy media to educate us. We have to do that work ourselves.
The good news is, you know, in November, New York City voters were given a pretty clear choice between candidates who wanted to hire 5,000 more police, 7,000 more police, give more impunity to these institutions, and someone who said, no, let's instead spend that money on a Department of Community Safety to create mental health resources, to create community-based violence reduction efforts. And a massive number of voters came out to vote for that vision. So now the challenge is to keep the pressure on to realize it.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you all for coming out. Let's big hand for Terence. And I hope some of you will stick around and buy a copy of the book. And great to see you all this evening.
Thank you, everyone.